So thank you very much for coming along to this seminar today, this hybrid seminar, which is really great to see people, particularly when it's a busy week as well. So it's good that we can have people joining online too. We've got Wisdom Dlamini here from the University of Eswatini. He's based in the Department of Geography, Environmental Science and Planning. And he's also director, I'm going to get the words wrong for this, Wisdom, director of the Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability. I always get them in the wrong order. At the University of Eswatini, and YESI, York Environmental Sustainability Institute, has a partnership through an MOU. So this is part of the activities within that partnership. So Wisdom, I will pass over to you to introduce yourself a little bit more and to give you a talk. Are you okay to share the screen whenever you're ready? You know what you're doing. Good stuff.
Right.
There we go.
Right. Good afternoon to everyone online and the colleagues, of course, here with me. As Lindsay has already indicated, Wisdom Dlamini from the University of Eswatini, where I am a senior lecturer there and also coordinating our Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Research, which is a center that we initiated just over 2 years ago. So it's relatively new. We're still learning. One of the reasons why we're here is to, of course, have that sort of knowledge exchange, get to know, our partners. That's why I put YESI there, because we've signed a memorandum of understanding or agreement between the two institutions, for collaborative research or any areas of mutual interest when it comes to the issues that are of interest to us. So that is really briefly about myself. So I do a lot of research on these issues of climate change, land use, of course, applied GIS, remote sensing, where over the last few years expanded to applied in health, in agriculture, even energy, and so on and so forth. But today my topic is really focusing on the climate issues, vis-a-vis land use issues in Eswatini. And without really further ado, taking much of your time, I don't intend taking too long, but just to share our experiences in Eswatini. Just a little bit of a background of Eswatini. Eswatini is one of those countries in Africa where cultural heritage is still really up at the heart of the government, at the heart of the people. There's still a lot of cultural practices that take place. And what I'm showing there are just some snippets of some of the cultural events, for instance, that will take place in Eswatini. The main one that I'm showing is photos of a royal hunt, which takes place once in a while, where young men like myself go out into the bushes to hunt different species of wildlife. But it's an event that takes place once in a while. In fact, we haven't had it in a while. I think this year we might have one after almost a 5-year ban on hunting. There was no hunting, strictly no hunting over the last couple of years. We have the reed dens, those ladies in the top right there. That is, those are princesses during the reed dens where the young ladies go out to cut reeds from wetlands. And those reeds are used to make the enclosure for the Queen Mother's residence. And below that is our Marula dens, our annual Marula dens, which normally takes place around February, early March, where married women go out to collect Marula's fruit and to make the Marula brew, and of course other gifts that they present to their majesties. And there's a whole weekend of festivities, dancing, beautiful dancing that takes place there. That's a brief of Eswatini. But again, just for context, for those of you that may not know about Eswatini, it's right in the southeastern part of the continent of Africa, where we are bordered by South Africa. Probably 80% of the country is bordered by South Africa, and then some 20% with Mozambique. Small as it is, 17,365 square kilometers of it, but we have quite a diversity of, in terms of topography, elevation. You can see within just a distance of 200 kilometers or so from east to west, elevation rises from a low of about 20 meters going all the way to close to 1,900 meters above sea level. So within that small space, so you have this very steep gradient, which also gives rise to, various temperature and rainfall regimes in the country, which also culminate in terms of the land uses that you see in the countries I will show in some of the maps. So some key information is that, Eswatini is an agro-based economy where agriculture really is the backbone and contributes significantly to the country's GDP. And a majority of the population really depends on agriculture, particularly subsistence agriculture for income and livelihoods. So if they are not practicing agriculture, they are employed in some agricultural activity. Hence, rain-fed maize accounts for majority, 84% of the cropped area in the country. And then irrigated sugarcane is actually the main crop in that top photo there, the sugarcane crop. Now, what are the challenges in Eswatini? We have a challenge. One of the key challenges that really is the focus of my presentation is a changing landscape, which is really a result of many things, some of which are highlighted here. The first one being, rapid urban expansion. Basically, they're growing human settlements all around the country, which are creating pressure on resources and infrastructure. And this is now becoming a problem where you find human settlements in areas that are even prone to natural disasters, flooding. I'll show you some images to demonstrate that. We also have issues of agricultural intensification. Obviously, with a growing population, there's also need for more food production. But most of this is also a result of expanding sugarcane fields. And most of that is actually due to demand from the EU. Most of our sugarcane estates are actually EU funded and driven. So most of that expansion that you see is a result of that. And of course, that creates pressure on not just the land, but also on the water resources, because sugarcane uses a lot of water, and it's grown in drier areas. So that creates most sort of conflicts. And of course, the warming climate change is hitting us hard. Much as we contribute a tiny fraction probably to the global emissions, but we are being hammered, we're feeling the heat and the impact of a changing climate, which results in a lot of damages, which I will demonstrate in the coming slides. And then the central question that we're trying to answer really as researchers, as the center, is how do we effectively manage our land resources in a way that ensures the environment is sustainably managed and also we meet people's needs. So it's a very tricky predicament that we are facing. Particularly if you look at the fact that this is showing the population from our censuses from 1904, I think the very first one that we have, all the way to the most recent one in 2017. The rest of the years are just projected trends from our Central Statistics Office. So you can see from a situation at the turn of the 20th century where every Liswati would have 20 hectares to him or herself, but now we're down to a hectare and a half. Now that's creating, a lot of competition for the limited land resources. It's also causing all sorts of problems, some of which I will highlight in my presentation. So this is just to show the issues around climate change, where you can see from the evidence from our meteorological stations, there's a very clear warming trend in the country. over the last 40 years. And that map over there, just is showing the change, the rate of change in terms of the degrees Celsius. So you can see over the last 40 years, the western part of the country, which is basically where you have the source of most of the catchments, is really warming up faster than the rest of the country, than the eastern part of the country, which is again a cause for concern because those are our water towers, if you like, that part of the country. And when you look into the future, again, things are not looking good. From the projections, IPCC scenarios, this is the 585, sorry, I wrote 485, 585. You can see it's projected to increase even further, and that will cause lots of problems in addition to what we are starting to see now. From a rainfall perspective, there's not much clear signal, but it's very slight, very small negative sort of change. But you can see from this graph that you have years that have excessive rainfall. In fact, if I were to extend that to the current, there's been 1 or 2 years. I think 2021 was one of the wettest years again. So you have those years that excessive rainfall resulting in flooding and so on and so forth, and of course followed by years of drought. And again, similarly, when you look at the projections into the future, slight decline, but what is likely to change the most is the seasonality, basically the temporal distribution of precipitation or rainfall in the country, which will result in all the uncertainties around, when to plant and so on and so forth. Now, one of the key challenges that we've had in the country is, of course, the limited data in terms of climate information. Now, what we are taking advantage of, obviously, is the use of space-based precipitation measurements. And one of the products that we've just recently tested with my colleague is the CHEPS rainfall product, which we tested in Eswatini using a number of meteorological stations. And as you can see from those metrics there, you can see that there's very good correlation between what is on the ground and what we see from the satellites, except for 1 or 2 problematic meteorological stations which don't tend to show, have very little correlation. But generally, we can start to, have confidence in some of these products, particularly for the areas that are undercovered, that are not covered by meteorological stations. I think we know that in Africa, generally, there's very little coverage because of limited human resources, limited finances. There's very little coverage in terms of meteorological measurements. Now, one of the issues that I've already highlighted is the issue of drought. And this is just showing records of significant drought events over the last 200 or so years in Eswatini. And again, just from historical records and other meteorological records, you can tell that the spacing between the major events is getting closer and closer. So we have more frequent droughts now than we had before. Even when you talk to the elders, they will remember specific drought events because it was so rare those days. But come post the 70s, things changed and we're seeing more and more frequent drought events, which is becoming problematic and results in scenes like this. This is our main cash crop, sugarcane, failed this year during that year. But I think that was 2015, 2016. We had a major drought. Rivers went dry, and we almost fought with our neighbors in Mozambique because some of our sugarcane fields were still irrigating, and yet they were complaining of lack of water downstream. So that creates that sometimes it can create those tensions between riparian water users. So these are the things that you can imagine the economic impacts that this might have. And then on the contrary, you have years that have excessive rainfall. This is 2021. we have major floods across the country, and areas that we never thought water would flow, such as this. We started to see scenes like this. But of course, some of it is attributed to the fact that poor planning, poor land use planning, and of course, increase in impervious surfaces, which increase the runoff and therefore causes rapid flooding in many areas, amongst other possible reasons. So these are some of the scenarios that we are starting to see frequently in the country, and that's also exacerbating erosion in many parts of the country. So the very intense, high intensity rainfall events would then cause erosion and cause such damage. So processes that will typically take decades, now you find that one huge storm will cause such damage. I think this is an area that Lindsay has done a lot of research on in Eswatini when it comes to land degradation, erosion issues. That's also having serious economic impacts. This is just a scene showing the damage to a road that had recently been resurfaced, to improve access to in rural areas. But one huge storm caused so much damage, that 1.6 billion emalangeni in pounds. You can divide that by 23, something like that. And that speaks for Eswatini. So you're seeing a lot of these events now: storms, hailstorms, devastating hailstorms, and so on and so forth. So what are we trying to do with this? Is we're trying to look for solutions to help the country plan better, to respond better to these challenges. And what I'm trying to talk about today, or what I will be talking about today, is just some of the geospatial approaches that we are using, where we are trying to now take advantage of the technologies that are coming through, the data that is increasingly being available for some aspects of land use, for instance, which I will demonstrate, high resolution observation data, to try and enhance the evidence, provide the evidence for policy, for action in Eswatini, because historically there's not been that much data or information to inform policy. So now with the technological advances that we're seeing, certain observations, we are now able to understand the complex feedback processes between the natural and environment and human activities. And of course, the increasing use of cloud-based analytics, Google Earth Engine, I think a lot of us in the geographies field now use that, enables us to use huge amounts of data and to be able to visualize that for policy decision. I remember presenting some of this information to some ministers, and they were seeing Eswatini for the first time, because driving around, sometimes you don't see things in the perspective that you see when you're looking at it from the top and in a holistic manner. So this is helping us to now have a better picture of what is happening. Geo AI, artificial intelligence, which we are now starting to integrate in our models to enhance our capability to predict land use changes, for various scenarios, is helping us to reach policymakers and decision makers even better. So now I'll demonstrate our land use, some of the land use analysis that work that we've done, we've been doing over the past few years. But in the interest of time, I'll just rush through. But just to summarize it, what we've been using, we are using a technique called continuous change detection, which is a technique that was developed in Boston University, where I did a little bit of postdoctoral work there, where you are able to track a pixel. So this is where the pixel comes in. You are able to track a pixel for, in this case, for a 30-year period, from 1990, be able to track what is happening to that particular pixel. In this case, I was tracking this pixel, which is right inside this water body. Now, you can see from 1990 up until 2009, this was probably just natural vegetation following the typical phenological cycle. But something happens around 2009, and that is when that reservoir was constructed, and it was constructed to what? To expand the sugarcane estates, which is what you see the green throughout all those areas. So this technique is able to help you track, systematic track a pixel and see what is happening, and you are able to see the year of change or the date of change of that particular pixel individually. So you are able to track every pixel. Similarly, in this case, I'm tracking this particular pixel here, which is now a sugarcane field, but before that, that was part natural vegetation. But somewhere in 2012, remember that reservoir, which is here, was commissioned in 2009. So 3 years later, that particular sugarcane field was established because now there's water to irrigate. So most of that water is coming to irrigate that. So we are able to track some of these changes. Of course, you can see that the signal now changes to something else. Yes, it has the typical vegetation phenological trend, but you can see it's something different than what it was before or prior to 2012. And again, this is another example of a pixel that is not changing. In this case, it's a natural forest. I always lose track of where my pixel is here, but it's somewhere in this mountain here, in this mountain range. So you can see places that have not changed. Because it's also important to see those areas that have not changed. So this is basically then what we came up with: annual land use, land cover maps for the 30-year period, which we are now extending to this year to see what has been changing over the years. So now we can see what is happening in terms of land use change and the impact that this has. This were validated using field data. This is surveyed data from our Eswatini Water and Agricultural Development Enterprise. So again, just to make sure that whatever we're measuring is actually what is on the ground. So this is from field survey measurements, ground surveys, and you can see the close match between those two data sets. So what we're seeing in terms of the changes, obviously now you start to see what is happening just from looking at just net change. Indigenous forest land, the indigenous woodlands, lost about over 25,000 hectares within that period. And so we also lost just over 10,000 hectares of grassland. And of course, you can see what is gaining ground at the expense of the indigenous forests and grasslands. Is obviously your croplands, both the irrigated and also rain-fed. In addition to the expansion of plantation forests, these are now your exotic forests, which typically tend to replace grassland. That's why you see it's almost similar in terms of the area there. And just to again visualize it, this is an old photo I got from somewhere or part of Eswatini in 1973. And I used a Google Earth Google Earth, to try and put the same that same picture in the same perspective or angle, and you can see the change that has taken place. Here you can see a lot of the Swazi people or the Maswati were probably self-sustainable. They were doing a lot of agriculture, in terms of food security, probably that was not much of an issue. But fast forward to this scenario where there's limited planning, loss of agricultural land, ecosystems. In fact, most of this is also wetland area. And this is next to our industrial estate. So most of this is driven by the growth of the industrial estate, where people come in from rural areas to look for employment, and therefore we have a creation of this informal areas, yeah, resulting in that scenario. The other thing that I want to just quickly talk about is on fuel. Due to various reasons that I would just briefly highlight, a lot of Emaswati, which is the Swati people, use firewood or depend on firewood for high energy uses or energy intensive uses such as heating and cooking. This is from our census, national census. So you can see that large parts of the country, 3/4 of those households rely on fuel wood for heating and cooking. Even though electricity is available almost everywhere, I'll show you the maps for that. So, but a lot of people, because of the high cost of imported electricity, we import most of our electricity from South Africa. It's very costly. I mean, every year it's going up and up and up, and a lot of Maswati cannot afford that. So they resort to using firewood. And of course, there's also high levels of poverty, particularly in the remote rural areas, which really makes it tricky to access that that electrical energy, even though it's just passing by. So a lot of people use it just for lighting, the very light uses of electricity. And this is evidence of that. If you look at now, this is use of electricity for cooking. So you can see it's just a flip of this map. So why here, these areas that have high uses of electricity for cooking, these are typically your urban areas. People are more wealthier, company towns, which tend to provide subsidized electricity and so on and so forth. And this is a nighttime light map of Eswatini, which shows that electricity is almost available almost throughout the country. It's widespread, but in terms of the use now, that's where things become tricky because of the reasons I've indicated. And we did some work again looking at how electricity use, again infusing that nighttime lights and also census data, where you can see that really electricity access in the country is almost all over the country. It's very high, one of the highest in Africa. I think we are the third, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of electricity access, which therefore results in this scenario where we're seeing a lot of fuel wood extraction. Now, this is again from work that we've collected data from a survey that was done by our forestry department, using that together with population data in a GIS. We then worked out, estimates of where fuel wood extraction is happening the most. So the darker colors, that's where you have lots of fuel wood extraction. And this is typically your savanna ecosystem, where you have the hardwood that a lot of people tend to prefer because it has high calorific value and so on and so forth. But again, these are some of the areas that are also rich in biodiversity. So now you have that conflict. So that is the map showing fuel wood extraction in terms of kilograms per year in the country. Now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to put up a model for fuel wood consumption to identify those hotspots and, of course, to be able to predict into the future. So we're looking at all that data on fuel wood demand and also integrating that with other data layers, your census, demographics, forest change data, and infrastructure maps such as roads to identify areas that are hotspots of human impact on forests. So yeah, like I said, those are the data sets that we are using. That's an example of those: census data, population, maps showing deforestation, and of course, that's showing roads and traffic movements. So we have data on people moving up and down in the country. And for that, we're using machine learning through Python workflows, where we are integrating all that data to come up with a modeling framework that is open source obviously. Gone are the days where we needed high performance computers and so on and so forth. So now with cloud analytics, cloud computing, it's now easy to do all these very intensive analysis without really the need of a very expensive computational infrastructure, which was one of the limitations back in the day in terms of modeling. And we are developing a gravity-based modeling. This is the one that we're trying to work on, a gravity-based modeling approach where we are looking at fuel demand as a function of all those other factors, population, supply from forest patches, distances between the source and the consumer, road accessibility, and so on and so forth, as shown in those that very simplistic formula. So that is work that is currently ongoing that we are working on to be able to identify priority zones for interventions, to map, the hotspots. Want to come up with a map that highlights the hotspots and also, again, highlight specific regions or chiefdoms or areas that are most at risk to fuel demand and ecological degradation. And a lot of the work that we are doing actually has had, very notable policy implications because first and foremost, most of that work went into designing our nationally determined contributions to say, now as a SWAT team, this is what we are seeing, what are our commitments in terms of our NDC, our commitments to the Paris Agreement. So most of that has had that impact in terms of policy. We have a forest policy and legislation that is under development now, and it's being informed some by the work that we've been doing, our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. The third iteration is also under development, and there's a land policy that is also underway. I was talking to the people working on that it's almost imminent. It's going to start anytime soon because for a long time we did not have a land policy. That's what enhanced perhaps the disjointed land use, lack of planning, and so on and so forth. So now we have a policy that's going to be informed by this work that we have been doing. And of course, we want to translate all that into policy. So want that collaboration between scientists, scientific inquiry, and of course, governance, the policy makers, the decision makers to make meaningful climate action. And that, of course, would have impact in areas such as climate smart agriculture, so that because we can see agriculture is expanding, but we need to find ways that that will make our agriculture not to have that much of an impact, and of course also adapt to the impacts of climate change, nature-based solutions for urban areas, for human settlements, expansions, and so on and so forth, and targeted restoration for areas that have been identified to be prone to land degradation, for instance. And this is just an example from our NDC, some of the targets. We want to shift from tier 1 to tier 2 greenhouse gas inventory because of the robust data and the methods that we are using now. We are able to move to tier 2 and, of course, reduce land degradation through tree planting and so on and so forth. And of course, those maps help a lot in identifying areas that require intervention, such as what you see. This is an area that we as the university have been working with the local community there to try and rehabilitate some of the areas that have been degraded. And there's a lot of work that is ongoing by various institutions and partners that are working to restore degraded lands, interventions on energy supply, and this is just from a recent work that we were doing, where the task was to look at drivers of biodiversity loss in order to inform the new National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, and also to help develop, our action plan as to align with the global biodiversity framework. And our analysis showed really some of the key drivers, and this is from analytics that we did. So the thicker the line, the more the influence. So you came up with this influence diagram based on quantitative data to understand what drives biodiversity loss, so that we can target particularly the thicker lines, the areas that tend to be key drivers of biodiversity loss. And now there's appetite to even expand protected areas. This is a map showing protected areas, those that are in solid lines, those are gazetted or legally protected areas, and these other ones are private protected areas. They may not necessarily be legally recognized as such, but there's that desire to expand, and this is one effort that is led by His Majesty the King, who's showing there, smiling. Basically, we are trying to create a huge protected area, merging all these protected areas into a mega conservation area. And the work that we've been doing over the past few years actually is informing that planning and the design in such a way that even the sugarcane estates are now trying to conserve certain areas such as this. So they are trying to now ensure that there's corridors, there's these patches of vegetation that they protect or leave out, particularly around streams or areas of biodiversity importance, so that even as they do their agriculture, there's minimal impact on biodiversity and so on and so forth. So that is really some of the work that we're doing. And now, going forward, we want to scale up this work. We want to make sure that there's interdisciplinary collaboration, research, where one of the reasons we are here is to create, strengthen those ties with, partners, people that can work with us to strengthen research in these areas. And of course, working with government and all civil society and so on. Capacity building, we want to train the next generation of Swatini scientists in some of these tools. Again, this is one of the reasons we are here to, tap on some of the knowledge that we might get from your exchanges that we might have to build this vision that we are having. So really success will depend on our collaboration, embedding these skills within our own institutions and sharing our successes and of course lessons learned with our partners across the region and the world. And as I draw towards a close, just to highlight some of the key areas that are of focus by our center. Really, one of them is the issue of climate change and the environment, where we want to improve estimation of GHG emissions, monitoring the environment, looking at future scenarios, looking at issues of human impact on the ecosystems and society, some of which is what I've demonstrated there, looking at the land use dynamics, but there's also issues of waste disposal. There's issues of climate justice, environmental governance, inclusiveness and justice, ethics and law, the effects of climate change on economic sectors, on transport, health, agriculture, energy, water, and so on and so forth. And then there's also interest in climate resilience. How do we build a climate resilient and also adapt to the impacts of climate change? We also have research interests around that area, and of course, sustainable economics and finance, with the issue of green growth, sustainable investments, and so on and so forth, that we want to also focus on as we try to help the country of Eswatini to develop in a more sustainable way. So we believe that by integrating the pixels, which I was showing, which really is a representative of the technology, policies, and the people, we can build a more resilient, sustainable future for Eswatini, and of course, other developing countries. I think that brings me to the end of my presentation, which is what I wanted to share with you on what we're doing, and of course, the possibilities of further collaboration should it spark research interest among some of you. These are some of the things that we do. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Wisdom. Do you want to stop sharing the screen so that we can see
Oh, yeah,
online people, and then we can see if there's questions in the room or
Absolutely.
online?
There we go.
Excellent, thank you very much. So any questions, let's start in the room, and if you put your hand up online, and then we'll come to you if you've got questions. You're getting rounds of applause online as well,
Yeah.
so lots of clapping. Abba, do you want to go?
Yeah, so it's an interesting presentation. My question is on the impact area, specifically on climate smart agriculture. So, are you looking at specific interventions for the sugarcane farmers that are carrying out irrigation? So, what are the climate smart agricultural interventions you are targeting for these farmers?
Sure. Yeah, it's just that probably I didn't have enough time to elaborate on some of, all the interventions that we are working on. But as a country, there's a very big move towards climate smart agriculture, both from the sugarcane sector and also small holder perspective farmers, to look at, for instance, water efficient irrigation methods. Less energy intensive, methods that we can use for irrigation, because as you saw, agriculture consumes a lot of water.
Yeah.
I mean, sugarcane consumes a lot of water. I mean, there's always these irrigation equipment running 24/7.
Yeah.
So we need to move towards more efficient methods and means, drip irrigation, for instance.
So, are you looking at maybe solar powered irrigation?
Yes, even solar powered irrigation, yes. Yeah, even solar powered, there are companies that are moving in that direction towards solar powered irrigation systems and so on. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Should we go Abroma, Sabine, Banky in that order, and then we move online? Abroma.
Yeah, I know I've talked about it here
Yeah,
2 days
sure.
ago.
Yeah.
I asked some reasonable question, but today is not in that line.
Sure.
So, you keep on talking about the trend. Did you, because what I'm seeing is an annual kind of trend. Did you measure the seasonal? Because you talked about the seasonal. So, like, to actually know, since you are trying to influence the policies and this climate smart agriculture, to be able to advise the farmers on which season, to be able to understand which season of the year that has more rain, which month. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. And again, you have a lot of stuff, because I was really wondering, but when you came to the policy, I found out you tried to make us to understand that you guys are just having land use, kind of land policy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was wondering maybe if they were there or the implementation of the problem. So does it mean that there are no, all this while they didn't actually have maybe policy in environment or agriculture, or they are not kind of effective, or are they just trying to update them now because you have a lot of, because if you don't have enough political will, most of what you're putting on might not be able to drive.
Yeah. Let me start with your last question. In terms of the policies, there have been bits and pieces of policies here and there dealing with this and that. The reason I was mentioning, for instance, the land policy. Land policy is the overarching policy, but we haven't had that. In fact, we don't have that in the country. It's never been there. There's been pieces of legislation here, some conflicting, some from colonial era policies, by the way, some going back to the 1940s, 50s, way back, which obviously have no relevance to today's scenarios. So there's been that challenge. And of course, there's also issues of implementation, enforcement that have been there, even with those older legislation and policies. But yeah, those are some of the issues. So the new policies that are coming up now are at least better informed by the evidence that we're providing. Now, your first question was on the trends. Yeah, there's actually more analysis that is and research that's going into that. To look at the shifts. In fact, one of the work that we are doing with one of our colleagues is to look at the shifts in the seasonality.
Yes.
How much shift has occurred and where. To also show on the map, this is areas where there's been shifts, and therefore you can't plant this here probably now, this is more suitable there, and so on and so forth. So there's more of that work that also needs to be done, which is again some of the areas of research that we are interested in. Yeah.
Now here's this very short one on that image of 1973 and 2021.
Sure.
So I was wondering, at what scale did you try to model to get the kind of, because that is 1973 and this 2021. how did we get out of 1973? And
Oh.
what came? Yeah.
Oh, the 73 one is the actual picture.
Okay.
It was actually a photo that was taken in 1973. And then the 2023 one was from Google Earth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking where there was another analysis. Before.
No, it's not. It's just a
Sort of secret satellite image.
Yeah.
The thing.
It was another person.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. I found it really interesting, and I'm not a scientist by background. But I wondered how much, what the sort of strategy might be for talking to the public about this. How have you engaged the public in this project?
Yeah, again, because of limited time, I couldn't go through all that. But there's been a lot of public engagements, both formally and informally, through various means to highlight the importance of climate change, land use change, and associated issues. There's been a lot from government, NGOs, civil society that's actively working with communities to educate them, or at least to bring that awareness. And but not just awareness, but also get feedback from them, because I mean the public has, particularly when you look at indigenous knowledge, there's been issues of we are currently working with our disaster management agency to create sort of a citizen science network, for instance, where even the public also give us feedback, provides information on what they are seeing on the ground. So you have that two-way flow of information. So there's of course there's still room for improvement, but there have been those efforts to try and engage the public through various media and approaches. Yeah.
I would just like to add that, for example, at the Faculty of Law in Belgrade, Serbia, we have been developing the different programs of communication with the public participation, access to environmental justice and climate justice. There are some good examples, and it would be my pleasure to share that material. So maybe it could be informative for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That we also I mean, we're happy to learn from what has worked in other countries, to learn from the best practices out there. Yeah. So yeah, because climate justice, like I indicated, is one of the areas of interest. Yeah. Unfortunately, I didn't talk more about that because that's not my area of research, but there's interest in understanding climate justice, public participation and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I've got another quick question about the land policy, because when I was doing my PhD in Eswatini many years ago, there was a draft land policy from 1997. And one of the reasons that policy didn't proceed was because there were tensions between the government and the traditional authorities. And I've got an observation and a comment.
Sure.
One of the points I want to make is a question around whether those tensions have been resolved, or whether that's still problematic. And the other point is that the land policy, there's actually a lot of good soil conservation practices and sustainable land management practices that exist in Eswatini, and they have done for ages, like the planting of grass strips around the contours and things like that, which obviously as your land parcels are getting smaller and your populations are getting bigger, those are the kinds of things that could be lost. So I just wondered if you know what's in that land policy and whether those good practices are being taken forward and not just you're not just starting from a blank sheet and saying, okay, let's just throw out the good stuff as well as the bad stuff.
Yeah.
So the traditional authorities and their grass strips.
Yeah. No, great question there, Lindsay. I think the answer to that is there's been two drafts. There's that 1997 one we have to talk about, but there's also a more recent one now, 2009. There was also another attempt in 2009, and those exact same tensions arose. Obviously, it was a different group of people then. 2009 it was a different group of people. So there's always that, because we have a dual land tenure system where you have freehold title deed land, and then a majority of the country is what we call Eswatini national land. Different categories or typologies of that. Some is leased to companies, some of it is unachieved. So there's always that tension in terms of, if you put this in writing, are you gonna say now the chief does not have authority, or issues of power dynamics then come into the fore? And as I said earlier on, Eswatini is a kingdom. It's managed by a kingdom, and under the king are chiefs, various chiefdoms spread around the country, who are looking after those parcels of land on behalf of the king. So you don't want to tamper with that power play. That there are these issues of who has. So if you come and say that the Ministry of Natural Resources shall do this, what are you saying to the chief there? Are you saying that the ministry is now on top of the chief? I'm just making an example, some of the tensions that do arise. So, but there is now, it's been resuscitated. So now there's more appetite to at least address it once and for all. Hopefully this time it's gonna work.
It's been a while.
Is there like kind of balance between, now there is balance between the government and the traditional rulers in terms of values? Because in Nigeria, what we have is the state government at the sub-national level.
Yeah.
They have right over every land.
Exactly.
So it's not like the traditional rulers have any authority over that. So
Which is the complete opposite.
Yeah, it's complete opposite of what you are saying.
Because in Eswatini we say umhlaba wenkhosi, the land belongs to the king.
Oh.
And by delegation to the chiefs.
Wow.
Yeah, so
It's complicated.
so the issues of governance,
My question,
The government, they can decide to take any land.
at any time.
Nah,
Yeah, so my question is on the fuel wood extraction as well.
yeah.
So what are the approach that you are bringing in terms of mitigating this continuous or increased fuel wood extraction? Because there is no alternative for these people
Yeah.
at the rural area. So
Yeah,
what are you doing in
It's-
terms of
yeah.
reducing that?
Actually, we are addressing that in multiple fronts. One, that forest policy that I talked about,
Yes.
and legislation that's being developed, will talk to that those issues. Number two, our energy policies are also being also looking at that from an energy perspective. How do we make electricity more affordable? Because some of the issues were around affordability. How do you make it more affordable, more accessible to the everyday Swazi? So we also looking at it from that angle. Yeah. And of course, there's also an expansion of community-based now mini-grids. There's interest in that to ensure that people have access to alternative energy sources rather than relying on the fuel. Because even that is, the supply is going down because of conversion and other things. Yeah, so,
Just have a look at the online questions. I don't want to miss the online people.
yes.
Doctors at the time.
So,
5 people saying things in the chat.
Okay, so I have Stephen here. Thank you very much, Wisdom, for the insightful presentation. Blah, blah. Okay, from Lusaka, thank you for the presentation. Thanks for the sharing insights.
I think Wick's got a question. He's working in northern Thailand, where there's a forest to crop conversion issue. Did you face any limitations or challenges when translating the spatial evidence and insights into policies?
Well, okay. Yeah.
Wick.
No, that's a good question. Well, I wouldn't say that there's been limitations because the maps are very clear. Where is the change happening? And you can actually validate that on the ground. So there hasn't been much, and particularly if you work together with communities, with the people that are on the ground, so it becomes easy. So it's not just something that is top down. So it's very easy to integrate that. So we haven't had much challenge. I think the biggest predicament all along has been the limited interaction between science and policy. Yeah, there's been quite a gap, but now we are slowly closing that science policy gap. so that, yeah, even the policymakers are starting to appreciate, like I was saying, I made a presentation to policymakers and they were like seeing this for the first time. Oh, so this is what is happening. So it gives them more, a better picture. And of course, even the local governments, the chiefdoms, the chiefs, are actually receptive for some of the interventions that government comes with, particularly in addressing land degradation. But of course, the issue is always limited resources. The problem is widespread, as we saw from the maps, it's all over the country. But limited resources sometimes are a constraint. Yeah. And then of course, the one is just an appreciation.
Are there any more questions from any online people that you want to ask? If they can type it now.
Yeah, I'm
If they
sure
haven't,
that
I think if they, type
Yeah,
now
I'm
if
sure
there
they
are any. Otherwise,
Yeah.
are there any more in the room?
if there's more questions
I'm
online.
sure Abby's
then-
got thousands of questions.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, again, it's still on bringing in the people. In closing this gap between science and policy, because
Yeah,
you will have definitely tension. Some will not want to buy into changing their way of doing things,
yeah,
especially those that are highly dependent
yeah,
on
Yeah.
fuel wood,
yeah,
and then poverty also. So there will definitely be
absolutely,
tension or trade-off
absolutely.
as a result of that. So how are you changing that?
Yeah, it's a very tricky one, actually. Now, now that you're mentioning that, I'm remembering back in, I think some 10 years or so ago, our Department of Forestry went around trying to enforce the existing legislation by, trying to arrest those who were illegally collecting or selling, because using is not the issue. Selling is what is prohibited. Because once you start selling, then you stimulate the market, and then you have a problem. They did that, but unfortunately, the legislature said, stop right there. These are people who are trying to make a livelihood, they are trying to make a living out of this, blah, 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 blah. So there was a direct conflict now. There's a law that says this, but now the legislators with that same thinking that, look, these are poor people, they are trying to make a living, So there was that conflict that was there. So with this new policy, we're trying to really have a harmonized framework, which covers, all those aspects, of course, trying to balance. It's a very tricky balance, I must say.
Because it's a challenge in Nigeria.
Yeah, absolutely.
Professor Renzi as well has done a lot on
Absolutely.
that. We even have charcoal association producers in Nigeria.
Yeah.
So you can imagine it's a big market.
Yeah. So that's that.
Any more questions?
No.
Or should we let Wisdom have some tea and cake, and then we can just have a mingle and a chat? So
All right.
thanks everyone for coming along the room. Thanks everyone online as well. And
Thank you.
feel free to follow up with Wisdom
Yeah.
if you want
Yeah,
email
please,
addresses
yeah,
and things,
sure.
if you've got questions
Yeah.
and further conversations,
Yeah.
including for the online people.
Right.
But, great, all right. Thanks very much, Wisdom. That was
Thank
great.
you. Thanks, our online colleagues. Thank you so much.
Well, then,